Yesterday we talked about a new type of number called an imaginary number, and then the second part of the lesson is where we combined the imaginary part with a real part, and we call those complex numbers. So let's go back and review some of the number systems we've learned. In kindergarten, when you first learned to count, you knew to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those were our natural numbers. And then while you were in kindergarten, you added 0 to that to give us that fulcrum, that balance of our number system, and those were our whole numbers. So the whole numbers contain all the natural numbers as well. And then towards late elementary, early middle school, you learned about integers, which are the whole numbers and all their opposites. So the set of integers contains all the natural numbers and all the whole numbers. Also in elementary, you learned about rational numbers. So that gave us our decimals, our fractions, because a rational number can be written as a fraction. So examples of that would be like 3/2, 1.8, -2.6, -32/5. All those would be examples of rational numbers. And then sometime during middle school, you added to that irrational numbers. Numbers like square root of 2, square root of 5. So the radicals that we can't take the square root of, the ones that are not perfect squares, are irrational. Also, you were introduced to numbers like pi, and this year we're going to add to that with e. And when we put all those rational and irrational together, that gives us our real number system. And up until yesterday, that's where we operated. All of our numbers fell within the real number system. But last year when we studied quadratics, and we talked about the number and type of solutions, if we had a positive discriminant, we said we had 2 real solutions. If our discriminant was 0, we said we had 1 real solution. But if the discriminant was negative, we said we had no real solutions. And some of your teachers may have told you there are 2 complex or 2 imaginary. That's because we need this final number system, the complex number system, to help us solve all the types of problems we're working with right now. So our complex numbers have a real part and an imaginary part. And everything we've learned falls within complex. The imaginary numbers, like the square root of -1, is I. That's our imaginary unit. It is part of the complex number system because the complex number system has the imaginary part and the real part. So now that we know about this new number system, we're going to learn how to do operations with complex numbers. So today, we're simply going to learn to add those numbers, add and subtract them. And at the top of your note sheet, you'll see our hint here. We're going to add the real number parts with the real number parts, the imaginary parts with the imaginary parts. So if we look at example A, you add the real with the real. So 3 plus 2 is 5. Then we add the imaginary part with the imaginary part. -1 plus 3 is +2i. And we do want to make sure we always write our answers in a plus bi form. So we have the real number part first and the imaginary part second. Okay, in example B, we have this imaginary number, 2i, added to this complex number, -4 minus 2i. So we're going to add real with real. Well, this has this real. Now we could think of this first number as 0 plus 2i, but even if we did 0 plus -4, we get -4. And now we're going to look at our imaginary parts, +2i and -2i. So those are going to cancel. So we took and added an imaginary with a complex, and we ended with a real number. Okay, example C. Now when we start to simplify, we're always going to deal with powers first. And I see this last term here, 4i squared, has a power in it. Now yesterday we talked about I squared, actually at the beginning of the homework today. So I squared. Well, if I is the square root of -1, what do we get when we square that? Well, when we square it, the square and the square root cancel, so I squared is -1. So 4I squared would be 4 times, if I squared has a value of -1, it's 4 times -1, which is -4. Whenever you see I squared, it's like multiplying by -1. And when we multiply by -1, all it does is change our signs. So if you just want to cancel it out and change the sign, you can certainly do that. So now we've dealt with the power. And then we have addition, addition. Oh, this one has subtraction. When we have subtraction and what follows is a complex, we need to distribute that subtraction throughout. So what we do is we change the subtraction to addition, and then we change the signs in the complex number that follows. So this goes from -2 to +2. This goes from +3i to -3i. And we'll do that anytime we see a negative. We're going to change the negative to a positive and change the signs in what follows. Okay, so 3 plus 2 is 5, plus -5 is 0, minus 4 is -4. And now let's deal with the imaginary parts. We have a -3i and a +i, so that's -2i. And there's my solution. Okay, if you're watching this for the first time, you can hit pause right now. And when you're ready, press play, and you'll see the answers to the 6 I want you to try. And here are the answers. So once again, when we have those powers, we need to simplify them. So I squared is like multiplying by -1, so it's going to change that sign. We distribute those negatives. We distribute the negatives. Here's an I squared. We're going to change the sign, so that becomes plus. If you have any questions about this, just ask me tomorrow. Thanks.